Veteran Story 13, The Price of Standing Up. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Eagle Thompson had been flying fighter jets for 15 years and had never backed down from a fight, whether in the air over Iraq or on the ground defending what was right. But during joint training exercises at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, Marcus discovered that sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones shooting at you from enemy aircraft, but the ones wearing the same uniform. When he witnessed 3 pilots brutally beating Airman First Class Darnell Washington simply because he was overweight and black, Marcus made a split-second decision that would cost him everything he'd worked for. Before we continue, write in the comments how old you are and what city you're from. And if you're new to Stories of General Dave, hit that subscribe button because we bring you the most incredible veteran stories every week. Marcus had earned his call sign Eagle during his first deployment to Afghanistan, where his exceptional flying skills and unwavering moral compass had made him a legend among fighter pilots. He'd flown 127 combat missions without losing a single wingman, and his squadron had the highest mission success rate in the entire theater. At 38 years old, Marcus was being considered for promotion to full colonel and command of his own fighter wing. His career trajectory was perfect, his record was spotless, and his future in the Air Force seemed unlimited. The joint training exercise was designed to test interoperability between different Air Force units, bringing together pilots from bases across the country for 2 weeks of intensive flight operations. Marcus was serving as the lead instructor, responsible for coordinating complex air-to-air combat scenarios and evaluating pilot performance. It was the kind of high-profile assignment that could accelerate his promotion timeline and establish him as one of the Air Force's rising stars. Airman First Class Darnell Washington was a ground crew member who'd been assigned to Marcus's aircraft for the duration of the exercises. At 22 years old and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Darnell was struggling with the physical demands of military service, but he was also one of the most knowledgeable and dedicated aircraft technicians Marcus had ever worked with. Despite facing constant harassment about his weight and race, Darnell maintained a positive attitude and took exceptional care of the F-16s under his responsibility. The harassment had been escalating throughout the first week of exercises. Captain Jake Morrison, a pilot from another base, had been leading a group of younger officers in systematically tormenting Darnell. They'd make comments about his weight, question his intelligence, and use racial slurs when they thought no senior officers were listening. Morrison was the son of a retired Air Force general and seemed to believe that his family connections made him untouchable. Marcus had heard rumors about the harassment, but hadn't witnessed it directly until the night everything changed. He was walking back to his quarters after a late briefing when he heard shouting from behind the maintenance hangar. Following the sound, he found Morrison and 2 other pilots, Captain Steve Richards and Lieutenant Brad Hayes, surrounding Darnell, who was on his knees trying to protect himself from their kicks and punches. "Come on, fatty," Morrison was saying, his voice slurred from alcohol. "Fight back like a real man instead of crying like a little girl." Richards was filming the assault on his phone while Hayes continued kicking Darnell in the ribs. "This is what happens when the Air Force lowers standards to let people like you in," Morrison continued, using a racial slur that made Marcus's blood boil. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Stand down," he commanded, using his full authority as the ranking officer present. The 3 pilots stopped their attack but didn't back away from Darnell. Morrison turned to face Marcus with a smirk. "Oh, look, it's the hero pilot. Don't worry, sir, we're just teaching the boy some discipline. Maybe you should mind your own business." The casual disrespect and obvious intoxication only fueled Marcus's anger. Hit that like button if this story got you hooked, because what Marcus does next will show you the true cost of standing up for what's right, even when everyone around you wants you to stay silent. "I said stand down, Captain," Marcus repeated, moving between the 3 pilots and Darnell. "This ends now. All 3 of you are confined to quarters pending investigation." But Morrison wasn't finished. "Investigation? For what? We're just having some fun with the quota hire. Nobody's going to care about some fat nobody." Marcus helped Darnell to his feet, noting the blood on his face and the way he was holding his ribs. "Airman Washington, report to the medical facility immediately," he ordered. Then he turned back to Morrison. "Captain, you're under arrest for assault, conduct unbecoming, and violation of good order and discipline." You and your friends will face court-martial for this." Morrison's smirk faded as he realized Marcus was serious. "You don't want to do this, Colonel," Morrison said, his tone becoming threatening. "My father has connections throughout the Pentagon. He can make your career disappear with one phone call. All three of us will say this never happened, and it'll be your word against ours." Richards and Hayes nodded in agreement, clearly confident that their version of events would be believed over that of a black airman and a pilot who was making waves. Marcus's response was immediate and definitive. "Then I guess we'll see whose word carries more weight in a court of law." He called the military police and had all three pilots arrested on the spot. The arrests sent shockwaves through the base, as Morrison's family connections were well known and his father's influence was legendary. But Marcus had made his choice, and he was prepared to face the consequences. The investigation that followed was a nightmare for Marcus. Morrison's father, retired General Robert Morrison, immediately began using his influence to protect his son and discredit Marcus's account of the incident. Phone calls were made to the Pentagon, pressure was applied to the base commander, and suddenly Marcus found himself being questioned about his own conduct and judgment. The official investigation was thorough, but clearly influenced by outside pressure. Richards had deleted the video from his phone, claiming it had been lost in a technical malfunction. All three accused pilots hired expensive civilian lawyers who began building a defense based on Marcus's history of racial favoritism and his pattern of interfering with military discipline. They painted him as a troublemaker who was using false accusations to advance a political agenda. What would you do in our hero's place? Would you stand by your principles even if it meant destroying your own career? Would you continue fighting for justice when everyone in authority seems to be against you? Let me know in the comments what you think Marcus should do when the system he served faithfully turns against him. The court-martial proceedings were a travesty of justice. Morrison's lawyers had gathered character witnesses who testified about his exemplary service record and his commitment to military excellence. They brought in expert witnesses who questioned whether the incident had actually constituted assault, suggesting that it was merely robust military training that had been misinterpreted by someone with a social justice agenda. Marcus's testimony was clear and unwavering. He described exactly what he'd witnessed, identified the racial slurs he'd heard, and detailed the systematic harassment that Darnell had endured. But his words seemed to carry little weight against the testimony of three officers who claimed the incident had been blown out of proportion by an overzealous superior officer who was looking to make a political statement. Darnell's testimony should have been the most compelling evidence, but he was clearly intimidated by the legal proceedings and the pressure being applied from Morrison's family connections. His medical records showed evidence of assault, but the defense argued that his injuries could have resulted from normal military training activities or even self-inflicted wounds designed to support false accusations. The verdict was predetermined. Morrison was acquitted of all charges, with the court finding that there was insufficient evidence to support accusations of racial harassment or assault. Richards and Hayes were given letters of reprimand for poor judgment while intoxicated, but faced no serious consequences. The message was clear. Protecting the wrong people could destroy your career, even when you were absolutely right. But Marcus's punishment was just beginning. Within weeks of the court-martial, he received orders transferring him to a remote base in Alaska, effectively ending his career advancement opportunities. His fitness reports began reflecting concerns about his judgment and his tendency to create controversy. The promotion to full colonel that had seemed inevitable was suddenly impossible. The transfer to Alaska was professional exile. Marcus found himself commanding a small radar station in the middle of nowhere, with no opportunity for the kind of high-profile assignments that would advance his career. His fellow officers treated him with suspicion, having heard rumors about his troublemaking and his inability to work effectively with his peers. He'd been branded as someone who couldn't be trusted to handle sensitive situations. Marcus's marriage began to suffer under the stress of his destroyed career and forced relocation. His wife Sarah had supported his decision to intervene in the assault, but she struggled with the consequences their family was facing. Their 2 children had to leave their friends and schools, and Sarah had to give up her own career to move to Alaska. The family that had once been proud of Marcus's military service was now paying the price for his moral courage. Subscribe to Stories of General Dave so you don't miss what happens next, because Marcus's story is about to show you how sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrificing everything you've worked for, and how true victory isn't always measured in promotions or recognition. Darnell Washington was quietly transferred to another base, where he continued to face harassment and discrimination. The assault he'd endured was swept under the rug, and his complaints about ongoing mistreatment were dismissed as the complaints of someone with a history of making false accusations. His military career became a series of dead-end assignments and negative evaluations. Marcus's time in Alaska became a period of reflection and reassessment. Away from the politics and pressures of high-profile assignments, he had time to think about what really mattered in military service. He began working with young airmen who were struggling with various challenges, providing mentorship and support that reminded him why he joined the Air Force in the first place. The isolation also gave Marcus perspective on the systemic problems within the military. He began documenting patterns of discrimination and harassment that he observed, building a comprehensive record of how the system protected perpetrators while punishing those who spoke out. His detailed reports went unread and unacknowledged, but he continued compiling evidence of institutional failures. Marcus's reputation among the enlisted personnel at his remote base was entirely different from his standing among the officer corps. The airmen respected him for his integrity and his willingness to stand up for what was right, even at great personal cost. Word spread throughout the enlisted ranks about the officer who'd sacrificed his career to protect a junior airman from racial harassment. The breakthrough came 3 years after the original incident, when a journalist investigating military discrimination contacted Marcus about his case. The reporter had been gathering information about systemic racism in the Air Force and had learned about Marcus's sacrifice and the cover-up that had followed. With Marcus's cooperation, she began building a comprehensive story about institutional discrimination and retaliation against whistleblowers. The article that eventually appeared in a major national magazine was devastating. It detailed not only the original assault and cover-up, but also the broader pattern of discrimination and retaliation that characterized military culture. Marcus's story became the centerpiece of an investigation that exposed decades of systemic problems and institutional failures. The public response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and political leaders called for investigations and reforms. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and the Air Force found itself under intense scrutiny for its handling of discrimination cases and its treatment of officers who reported misconduct. Morrison's career imploded when the article revealed the full extent of his family's influence in covering up his crimes. The connections that had protected him became liabilities when the public learned how they'd been used to subvert justice. He was quietly forced to resign from the Air Force, ending his military career in disgrace rather than advancement. Marcus was vindicated by the investigation that followed, but the victory felt hollow. His career had been destroyed, his family had suffered, and the system that should have protected justice had instead protected those who perverted it. The apology he eventually received from Air Force leadership felt inadequate compared to the price he'd paid for doing the right thing. What do you think the antagonist deserves? Do you agree with the hero's actions? Should Marcus have found a different way to handle the situation? Or was direct intervention the only moral choice? Was the system's retaliation against him justified? Or does it reveal fundamental problems with military culture? Let me know in the comments what you think about standing up for others and the price of moral courage. The reforms that followed Marcus's case were comprehensive and long overdue. New policies were implemented to protect whistleblowers, strengthen investigation procedures, and hold senior officers accountable for discrimination within their commands. The changes came too late to save Marcus's career, but they provided protection for future service members who found themselves in similar situations. Marcus eventually retired from the Air Force with full honors, his record cleared of the retaliatory fitness reports that had been used to punish him. The ceremony was small and quiet, attended by the enlisted personnel who'd served under him in Alaska, and a few senior officers who'd eventually recognized his integrity. It was a bittersweet ending to a career that should have reached much greater heights. Darnell Washington also left the military, but his departure was by choice rather than punishment. He'd used his technical skills to earn a degree in engineering and found a civilian job with a defense contractor. He remained in contact with Marcus, gratefully acknowledging that the colonel's intervention had likely saved his life and certainly preserved his dignity. Marcus's post-military career became focused on advocacy and reform. He worked with veteran organizations to support service members facing discrimination and retaliation. His experience navigating the military justice system made him an invaluable resource for others who found themselves fighting the same battles he'd fought. The remote radar station in Alaska, where Marcus had spent his final military years, was eventually renamed in his honor, a recognition of his integrity and moral courage. The dedication ceremony was attended by dozens of airmen he'd mentored, officers who'd learned from his example, and civilian advocates who'd been inspired by his story. Marcus's marriage had survived the ordeal, strengthened by the shared commitment to doing what was right regardless of the cost. Sarah had become an advocate in her own right, working with military spouses who faced retaliation and discrimination. Their children grew up understanding that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice, and that integrity is worth more than advancement. The lesson of Marcus's story became required study at military leadership schools, though the full details of his case were often sanitized to protect institutional reputation. The sanitized version focused on leadership and integrity while minimizing the systemic failures and retaliation that had characterized his experience. But the enlisted personnel who heard the story understood the real message about standing up for others, regardless of the personal cost. Years later, when Marcus would speak to military audiences about leadership and integrity, he would always emphasize that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee a happy ending. Sometimes moral courage requires sacrifice, and sometimes the system punishes those who challenge it. But he would also emphasize that the alternative, staying silent while others suffer, was a price too high to pay for any career advancement. The three pilots who had assaulted Darnell Washington all eventually left the military, their careers ultimately damaged by the investigation that followed Marcus's case. Morrison's father's influence couldn't protect them forever, and their actions during that night behind the maintenance hangar became defining moments that overshadowed any subsequent achievements. They'd learned too late that some actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Marcus's legacy in the Air Force was complex and contradictory. Officially, he was recognized as an officer of integrity who'd stood up for his principles. Unofficially, he remained a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging the system and the price of moral courage. But among the enlisted personnel and junior officers who'd served with him, his reputation was unambiguous. He was the officer who'd sacrificed everything to protect someone who couldn't protect himself.